Debbie, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to have a chat today.
Thank you. Can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I suppose most of my career was spent in law enforcement with the same agency. I worked for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for a little over 30 years. And during that time, I had a variety of assignments. I started out as undercover narcotics, they hired me straight out of college to drive. They trained me for about 7 weeks, and I drove all over the state of Georgia buying crack undercover in my personal car for
Oh,
seventeen
gee.
thousand dollars a year. That was my entrance into law enforcement, and I did that for about 4 years. That position doesn't exist anymore, but from there I went to the other end of the spectrum and I worked healthcare fraud for many years. I worked in our state fusion center and helped manage the terrorism intelligence component of our fusion center here in Georgia. I helped manage our Atlanta field office for a couple of years, and they basically investigate all types of crime: rape, robbery, homicide, political corruption, officer involved use of force. But the last 8 years of my career, I spent as the supervisor, the special agent in charge over GBI's Child Exploitation and Computer Crimes Unit. And whoever holds that position in the GBI is also the ICAC commander for the state of Georgia. So the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. I was the commander of the task force in Georgia for the last 8 years of my career. And by far, it was my favorite assignment. I retired a few years ago, it's about 3 years ago, and since then I've been working in the private sector, mainly with technology companies who make tools and solutions, software solutions that help us in the fight against child exploitation and other crimes.
So, how did you originally get into law enforcement? Was that what you went to college for, or
You know,
was that just kind of an opportunistic job?
So I wanted to be a pilot in the Air Force, and I was in Air Force ROTC in college, and I found out I was too short. I ended up not going into the Air Force, but had a conversation with the cadre there, and I didn't want a normal job. I wanted something exciting and adventurous, and we sort of settled on me changing to a criminal justice major.
Hmm.
And I majored in criminal justice at the University of Georgia. I had to do an internship in order to graduate, and did my internship with the GBI, with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. And about 6 months after my internship, I was hired to be a narcotics agent. And that's how my career started. I didn't grow up wanting to be in law enforcement. I don't have a familial connection to law enforcement, but I didn't want a normal job.
Yeah.
And I'll admit I'm a little bit of an adrenaline junkie and wanted something a little bit out of the box and
Yeah.
exciting. And that's what I got.
Yeah. I can see that there's no way that a in the field law enforcement officer is at anything but different every day.
It was absolutely different every day. I loved almost every minute of my career, my law enforcement career.
And so, what caused the transition into the child exploitation uh, area?
So I was promoted into that position. Admittedly, I had never really worked specifically child sexual abuse material cases or online child sexual exploitation cases. I had to learn from the people that I was supervising. I did that by asking a lot of questions, taking training. I read lots of case files. We had special agents, sworn special agents in that work unit, as well as digital forensic examiners in that work unit. And again, I asked lots and lots of questions. I will say that it's probably the only time in my career where I consistently felt as though we were really, really making a difference and arresting real bad guys
Hmm.
on a regular basis. So it has become my passion, even in retirement, to continue to help those that are still working those types of investigations.
And so were you working many of those investigations kind of pre-internet, or has most of it been post-internet? Because I know, like, when I was a kid, it was always, the stranger danger until they realized,
Right.
gosh, most child exploitation is by friends and family.
Yes.
But I kind of like the impression I get is with the internet that has now shifted back to the concept of it's less likely to be someone who's a familial. But
It's
I may be
it's
wrong in this area.
it's all of that, unfortunately. So when I started at the Child Exploitation and Computer Crimes Unit, it was in October of 2013. And yes, the internet was the main was we used online child
Yeah.
exploitation on the internet. Prior to that, there was the law calls it child pornography. We prefer to call it child sexual abuse material. But child pornography was traded via the mail.
Yeah.
Hard copy photos, CDs, things like that, until the internet, and those things sort of, for the most part, went by the wayside. As far as the type of criminal, the type of predator, it's still a lot of most predators are, or most children are victimized by somebody that they know.
Okay.
However, there's this new element, and I guess it's not new anymore, but there is this element now of you don't necessarily have to know your abuser. There are plenty of people, predators online, who will lie, manipulate, a child to in order to victimize them in a variety of different ways, whether that's asking them to send intimate photos, or monetarily, or there are a number of ways children can be victimized, not just online sexual exploitation, but a variety of ways. And yes, the predators are online, but I am not going to discount the what we used to be familial
Mhm.
and people in the community. That still absolutely occurs.
Okay. Um, just kind of a kind of a resources thing in terms of how law enforcement is involved. My basic understanding of law enforcement is back in the day when it was mostly mail, that makes that becomes federal, local and
Yes.
federal because it's crossing state lines, so to speak.
The Postal Service, the Postal Inspection Service used to be one of the main law enforcement entities that worked child pornography or child CSAM, or CSAM investigations, because it was going through the mail. And now there are several agencies or task force programs that really are the ones in the United States that concentrate on working CSAM related investigations. So, the FBI, HSI, Secret Service, they all have an element that works child exploitation investigations. However, really in the United States, most CSAM investigations are worked by state and local law enforcement who are part of the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force program, which is a federally funded task force program. And there's 61 ICAC task forces across the country, and they receive federal funding as well as hopefully other funding from their states, from their agencies, in order to manage and coordinate the ICAC task force program and investigate CSAM related investigations. So it really is local, state, and federal all working together, and even globally, international law enforcement, because these crimes don't have a border. The internet is obviously global, therefore these crimes are global. So it really is one of the most collaborative law enforcement efforts in the world.
Is this one of those types of crimes like I've heard, having interviewed lots of people in law enforcement with respect to fraud, there's a lot of challenges working with counterparts in other countries because less of a priority, or hey, the kind of the perception, well, maybe one of the people involved in the crime was here. We don't feel that it was perpetrated here. It was perpetrated there. Therefore, we're not going to, provide the resources. It's just kind of one of those areas of crimes where nobody is willing to say yes, this is okay, or no, we don't want to do something.
So I'm not going to say that doesn't happen. There are, across the globe, priorities are
Yeah.
different. However, when you're talking about the sexual abuse of children, people and law enforcement do tend to prioritize this particular crime. I'm not saying that's always the case, but it is, everyone feels equally that it's as horrific as you can, as horrific a crime as you can commit. So there are, as far as working together across jurisdictional boundaries, that actually does happen. Now, as
Mhm.
far as here in the United States, for the most part, law enforcement has agreed, and this, again, this is a generalization, it's not always the case, but law enforcement and the ICAC task forces have agreed that whoever has the perpetrator, the suspect, will be the main law enforcement
Mhm.
entity that works an investigation. However, we absolutely, our main goal is to identify victims and safeguard those victims. So that is also a priority. So we end up having to work together because it's very common to have a suspect in one jurisdiction and
Yeah.
victim or multiple victims in across other jurisdictions. So we have to work together.
Does it tend to be the investigations are started based off of a victim, or they started based off of, you know, we found material with this particular individual and then going out trying to figure out who the victims are, or is it a little bit of both?
It's both. But the way that most of the ICAC task forces get their cases is from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So the way they get, so I'll back up even further
Mm-hmm.
from that. There is federal law that requires internet service providers. So Meta, Snap, all of the apps on your phone, Comcast, Microsoft, Google, any internet service provider or the apps on your phone, they are required by federal law to report instances of child exploitation that they find on their platform to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They're not required to look for it,
Mm-hmm.
but if they find it, they have to report that. Now, many of them do look for it, and they're good, and that's a whole different conversation. So they report it to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who then sort of triages it, adds information to it, and then passes that cyber tip. They're called cyber tips
Mm-hmm.
to one of the 61 task forces across the country. Now, they also refer cases internationally and they refer cases to federal law enforcement as well. But for the most part, most cyber tips that are actionable are sent to one of the ICAC task forces across the country. And that number, so I will tell you about the increase in that number. So when I started in 2013 in Georgia, we were receiving approximately 2,400 cyber tips a year.
From
Last
from the national.
from the National Center for Missing and
Gotcha.
Exploited. Last year, they received over 30,000
Oh my
cyber tips.
goodness.
So, and if you go on the National Center's website, you can see there's a lot of stats. You can see, the total number of cyber tips that are being reported. Most of them are from internet service providers. Some are from the public, but most are from internet service providers. But that number has increased dramatically. So in Georgia, the number of cyber tips that we received doubled about every 2 years.
Oh my goodness. Have the resources that you guys have to work with, have those doubled every 2 years?
Absolutely
Or
not. In fact, they have not increased at all. So federally, the ICAC program is still funded at the same rate as it was when it was founded.
Mhm.
And it was founded way before I took over as commander in 2013. So while we did receive additional funding each year in Georgia, for the most part, it did not keep up with the increase in cyber tips.
Mhm.
Across the country, ICAC task forces are grossly under-resourced. In Georgia, we were fortunate enough where the GBI supplemented by, they paid for all of our salaries, they paid for our equipment, that sort of thing. The task force, the ICAC task force funding that we received paid for software tooling, paid for training of local law enforcement. There were things that funding paid for, but there was never enough people.
Yeah.
There's never enough technology to keep up with the influx of cyber tips. And that's true today across the country.
So for the vast majority of the local chapters, so to speak, they're for the most part they're underfunded.
Absolutely.
Is there a push to increase funding? I mean, clearly the groups want to increase funding, but is there a kind of a grassroots effort to increase funding?
So, interestingly enough, when I retired from law enforcement, there were several other ICAC commanders who retired around the same time, and there were several that had been retired for a few years and still working in the space, sort of like I do. We all formed a group, a lobbying organization called Raven, and Raven was created to lobby Congress for additional funding for the ICAC task forces. Now, we were retired cops. We did not know how to lobby Congress, but we did what we always had done, and we figured it out. We've been in existence for about 2 years, and we have become a resource on Capitol Hill for lawmakers in this particular area. They had heard from NCMEC about the increase in cyber tips. They had heard from organizations like Thorn, and those are great organizations, but they had never heard from law enforcement and how all of the work that's being done in the space trickled down to law enforcement, who then did not and does not have enough resources to actually work all of the cases that are being provided to them. The system in place is good. However, at the end of the line where law enforcement is, there's not enough resources to work all of the cases.
Yeah.
So Raven formed, and we also help lawmakers with legislation that helps make these types of investigations easier and helps make the internet safer.
So what percentage, if you kind of know just from your experience, just kind of roughly, what percentage of the cases and the tips result in an arrest or resolution?
So I will tell you, I'll give you Georgia stats. I don't know across the board, but from what I've heard, it's very similar across the country. So last year, or the year before, Georgia received over 30,000 cyber tips and made a little over 450 arrests. That is good, but there was so much more work. It's not because they aren't trying. It's not because they're not working. There's literally not enough time in the day or the week or the month or the year to work all of the cases that they're getting. Now, admittedly, I don't want to leave people with a misconception.
Yeah.
30,000 cyber tips to Georgia. Some of those can be closed because there's not enough information in them to initiate an investigation. Some of them may be age difficult. Some of them may not rise to the level of a crime in Georgia. So some of them are closed automatically, but Georgia hovers around 450 arrests a year. And I know that seems really like there's a large discrepancy, but that's as much as they can do.
And I assume that's, see if I can phrase this properly, each tip is not necessarily an isolated case. In that there may be 10 tips all involving the same incident or the same perpetrator.
If we're talking about technology, that is one of the things that NCMEC is now trying to help with, because all of the cyber tips used to be pushed to us individually. And sometimes we would say, oh, these cyber tips are related. But NCMEC actually has some technology that they're using that will now help deconflict or group some cyber tips together, whether it's same or similar victims, or the same suspects. And they can do that in a variety of ways using technology, whether it's IP addresses or phone numbers or email addresses, or there are ways to group those together, and they're doing that now. So yes, there are some cases that involve multiple cyber tips.
Yeah. So can you talk about some of the technology that's now being brought to bear on this issue?
Absolutely. We've talked about the scope of the problem, but like how technology helps us fight back. I work with a lot of digital forensics companies, and they are doing everything from mobile phone forensics to, camera forensics to car forensics. All of those things can be related to these types of investigations. So they're recovering data, they're recovering deleted data, they're looking at geolocation, photos, chats, all of those things. So I'm a huge proponent of digital forensic examiners, and I am their champion. I lovingly call us all nerd cops. So, but digital forensics technology, AI and machine learning is really taking hold and helping with this crime with regard to image classification. So finding CSAM. So say an examiner downloads a phone and is looking for CSAM on a phone. It used to be that they would literally have to scroll through tens of thousands of pictures on a phone and manually find those. There is technology now that will help them find that imagery, whether it's hashing technology or artificial intelligence. We have databases of known imagery. And so those things are definitely helping in this particular arena. If you talk about things like undercover operations and sometimes we can tell when people are trading child, sexual abuse material. We are learning how to go onto the dark web and conduct investigations there. There have been some amazing investigations on the dark web. So, those are some of super briefly, some of the ways that technology is being used in this particular crime. But, collaboration is key. Law enforcement working with the tech companies to say, hey, these are our challenges. This is what we need. And then training providers, training people, to use these tools to how to conduct investigations on the dark web. So all of those.
Is there much collaboration with the kind of the OSINT community? And I remember there was I for the life of me can't remember a campaign from an app maker basically saying anytime that you go into a hotel room,
Right. I forgot what the name of that is.
take a picture of the hotel room. It
Right.
gets uploaded to a database that allows. Now we have backgrounds that can be identified in abuse photos.
There's the OSINT community is heavily involved, especially in finding missing children who are disproportionately victimized, and in the trafficking world. So the OSINT community is heavily involved in finding missing children, and they are very, very good at that. So there is absolutely some collaboration between OSINT technology companies, OSINT practitioners, law enforcement, even the examiners and investigators, because, for law enforcement to have all of those skills, whether they're a sworn badge and gun toter whose specialty is writing search warrants and conducting interviews, to the digital forensic examiners who are looking at the data from mobile phones, to OSINT practitioners who are conducting investigations online, trying to find, bits and pieces of where someone may be. All of those things have to go together. Thank God, right? Like,
Yeah.
And it really is an interesting collaborative community. Even in my 30 years in law enforcement, this particular crime type and the nerd cops that help investigate, the ones that understand technology, It is a incredibly collaborative community. And there's places where they congregate, whether it's the digital forensics Discord server, whether it's LinkedIn. There's a huge digital forensics and OSINT community on X, and some of them are migrating to Blue Sky. There's lots and lots of places where they collaborate and learn from each other, not just collaborate about cases, but hey, I learned how to do this.
Mhm.
And I wanted to share it because I know it'll help other people.
We've mostly been talking about what happens after the fact, after the exploitation happens. Is there technology being worked on to try to prevent and detect stuff earlier in the process?
So I guess I'll go to the trust and safety community, with that answer. So the internet service providers, almost all of them have a trust and safety department, lane, work unit within their company that basically tries to make their platforms safer.
Mm-hmm.
Some do a better job than others. That's also something that Raven works on and helps others understand. But they do use technology to find this content on their platform, whether it's photos and videos, whether it is chats inside of their messaging platforms. There is technology that is helping find this content, but also a lot of those providers are implementing education campaigns. I know Snap has one that has recently come out, and trying to educate and put safeguards in place for kids and parents
Yeah.
online. Again, some of them can do better. That's also another podcast. That's another. Some of them can do better, but many of them do have these uh, departments in place to at least try to help with those things.
And so if, I guess it's probably, maybe it's the same question. If parents, friends, or people want to report um, either actual exploitation or suspected exploitation or attempts, what's the best channel to go out reporting?
So I'm going to give you a few different answers. So if it's on a platform, say it's on Instagram, there are in-app reporting features, and they need to do that,
Mm-hmm.
especially if it's underage, and they need to report that to the platform because we want the platform to preserve that, but also take it down
Yeah.
so it's not still out there causing harm to someone. You can report it to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. You can do it on your phone, you can do it on your computer. There is a cyber tip line reporting mechanism on their website, and you can also report to local law enforcement. So, those are all places where if someone is being victimized, or even if you find illegal imagery, those are all places where you should report.
Are there any, because you've worked on the investigative side, are there things that people should include in those reports that they might not think to include in those reports that would be helpful for the investigation?
I'm going to say as much information as possible, but sometimes people don't understand that law enforcement, while if you are being victimized, say it's a sextortion, someone is trying to, maybe you have sent intimate imagery to someone, and now they are trying to get something from you, whether it's more intimate imagery or money or something like that. Cease all contact, but save the accounts, the
Mm-hmm.
images, the chats, all of that, because law enforcement is going to need that in order to help you. So, while we don't want you to continue contact, we do want you to save anything that we may be able to use to identify who is doing this, to help make a case, about what they did, to tell to build a
Yeah.
story. And sometimes people don't. They feel like they want it deleted, they want it off their phone, and I understand that feeling. But in order for law enforcement to do their job, they're going to need that. Um,
particularly on platforms where messages can be deleted, I suppose.
Absolutely. And there are times where, in certain circumstances, law enforcement can obtain that information from the internet service provider, but not always. So it's best to save everything for law enforcement.
And be able to have dates, times, time zones, places,
Yep.
be as specific as possible.
Absolutely. And accounts, what account was messaging you? Did they send you pictures? Did they ask you to go to another platform? Are there multiple platforms involved? All of that will be needed.
Gotcha. You talked about people wanting, kind of the initial responses. I want to get rid of delete stuff as quickly as possible because I just don't want it
You're
out there.
embarrassed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I get it. Totally makes sense.
Mhm.
On the flip side of that, in terms of when material is already out there and being distributed, how difficult is it to get that material taken down?
So we used to tell, kids, everyone that once it's out on the internet, you can't get it. It's too late. And there are systems in place where you can have your images removed. And if you are underage and your images are on the internet, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children will help you get those taken down off of the internet. It's if you Google "take it down" at the missing, and their website is actually missingkids.org. But if you Google NCMEC or National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and "take it down," that is where you can go to have your images taken down. Now, if you're an adult, it is hang on, stop stop. Okay, sorry.
That's
It's
okay.
stop non-consensual intimate image abuse, and it is stopncii.org. And if you're an adult, they will help you get your images taken down. So there's also one in Canada, and I always forget the name of it. But there are ways for you to get your images taken down, and there is legislation moving through Congress right now called "Take It Down,"
Yeah.
the Take It Down Act, and they there will be requirements for individual platforms to create processes where you can more easily have your images taken down. However, if you are underage and you notify a platform that you are underage and you need this image taken down, it's normally taken down. And if they don't, there's some penalties that they'll have to pay.
And I guess that's one of those things that you make sure to include in a report. If the person is underage, make sure to mention that in the report.
Yes.
That way it's clear from the beginning.
Yes.
Are there any other particular resources or technology we should be aware of?
I think the only thing is, if we're talking about CSAM and prevention of things like this happening, I would just encourage parents to talk to their kids. They start early with age appropriate conversations. Again, the National Center on their website, missingkids.org, has videos and talking points for all things, not just CSAM related,
Mm-hmm.
but personal information and bullying and all sorts of things for you to talk to your children. There's also an organization in the UK called IWF, and they have some really great talking points, as does Thorn here in the United States. So if you are struggling with how do I start the conversation, there are places online that will give you conversation starters and videos that you can show your children that are age appropriate. And so I suppose that would probably be
Yeah.
the only other resource that I would encourage parents to go to.
And then I suppose just for individuals, if any conversation or any communication is getting weird, block the person.
Yes,
like
absolutely. You do
like
not have to continue that conversation, and I would encourage you to not continue that conversation and simply block and block the person and have no more contact with
Yeah.
them.
Yeah, that's probably a good starting point. If something starts to go weird, just don't
I,
even have the chance of it
yeah,
getting further.
yeah. I do think some people have a problem like just stopping a conversation and doing that, but I guarantee you'll feel a whole lot better and you won't have to worry about it anymore. Just
Yep. And if people want to connect with you online, either they want to help or they have questions, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
I'll give you two resources. So I'm on LinkedIn fairly heavily, and it's Debbie Garner, and you'll know it's me because one of the first words in my tagline is Nerd Cop. You can also email me at debbie@hexordia.com. I work for a digital forensics training provider, and we are very involved in mental wellness as well as, training digital forensic examiners to do some of the things that we've talked about today.
And just as an aside, for people that are in your field, this kind of content and these situations have to put an emotional toll on people in the field. Are there resources for people in this field to get help as
Yes,
well?
yes, absolutely. And, in fact, people can reach out to me about that as well. But there is an organization called the Innocent Justice Foundation, and they have a program called Shift, and they provide wellness training and resiliency training to law enforcement who works these types of investigations. And the training is free because they receive federal funding
Mm-hmm.
from the ICAC Task Force program to provide this resiliency training to law enforcement. There are also resources online from them. But if someone is struggling, they can certainly reach out to me and I will absolutely help them. There are plenty of people in this space that will talk to them, care providers, as well as people who have been there, law enforcement who have been through this that will absolutely be willing to talk to someone.
Great. Debbie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Sure, I enjoyed it.